The North American Railroad is a massive industry that's existed for more than a century, so it comes as no surprise that rail transportation companies are constantly innovating. Nowadays, most railroad innovations are more related to maximizing short-term profits, but as climate change becomes an increasingly relevant issue affecting us all, railroads are becoming increasingly focused on decreasing their environmental impact. If you've been following railroad news over the past few years, one common solution to this problem is the implementation of battery electric locomotives instead of full electrification. Today I'm going to explain why this is not only a step in the wrong direction, but possibly even worse than continuing to use diesel locomotives. Unlike other countries that electrify their railroads, the United States has almost always opted to run off diesel power, in many parts due to the abundance of crude oil and reluctance to invest in expensive electric infrastructure. While electric locomotives are more powerful, lower maintenance, and of course better for the environment, since the majority of rail lines in North America are owned by private companies, the massive cost of implementing electric trains is almost always not worth their investment. Unfortunately, this leaves us in a bit of a pickle. Burning literally billions of gallons of diesel fuel every year isn't a good look for railroads, but electrification is a huge investment. This is where battery electric equipment comes in. Like an electric car, these locomotives run off stored electricity, meaning they don't need overhead wires, but they also don't burn any fossil fuels. Best of both worlds, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not this simple. Allow me to explain. There's two types of battery electric locomotives being considered for freight use in North America, both hybrid and pure battery power. Pure battery power is exactly what it sounds like. Battery electric locomotives being used to haul trains under their own power. Probably what you'd expect when you think of a battery electric locomotive. Progress Rail's Joule platform is setting out to do exactly this, with 5 different variants of lithium-ion battery locomotives with outputs ranging from 4 to 14.5 megawatt hours. Unfortunately though, even the most powerful of the Joule locomotives, the SD70J-BB, is not nearly as efficient as a comparable diesel. Let's do some math. At full throttle, with an output of 4,500 horsepower, the SD70 Ace, a comparable diesel, consumes 187 gallons of fuel per hour, and with a 4,800 gallon fuel tank, this means the SD70 Ace can run at full power for just over 25 hours. In other words, the diesel locomotive is capable of producing 4,500 horsepower for 25 hours, and when converted to megawatts, this output increases to 86 megawatt hours. Even at full throttle, the locomotive's least efficient setting, its power output is far better than the battery electric SD70's 14.5 megawatt hours. To add to all this, we don't even know how the SD70J's power is measured. Is it 14.5 megawatt hours at idle, full throttle, or a combination of these two? Either way, even if Progress Rail was measuring the power at full throttle, the diesel would completely blow it out of the water in terms of range. Of course, the SD70J does produce far fewer emissions than a diesel, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't cause any pollution. As has been said already by hundreds of environmentalists, the process of mining the lithium used in battery production is terrible for the environment, and it's only getting worse as these materials get more scarce. Adding to this, lithium-ion batteries degrade over time, especially when put under high stress such as extreme weather and constant abuse, something which all locomotives are expected to deal with on a regular basis. The amount of maintenance and battery cell replacements needed to keep these locomotives operating will certainly work against their positive environmental impact, and honestly, these locomotives' weak power output, high maintenance, and impracticality may render them pollution themselves, being stored indefinitely when railroads realize their issues. Ultimately, the idea of a fully battery-powered locomotive really just isn't that practical for long-haul freight trains, but it won't stop railroads from ordering these locomotives to improve their public image. Similar to pure battery electric locomotives, hybrid battery locomotives are engines powered completely by batteries, but their use on the railroad is slightly different. Instead of powering trains entirely on their own, hybrid battery locomotives, such as Wabtec's FlexDrive, work in conjunction with diesel locomotives to increase a train's efficiency, recapturing the energy lost in braking. Unlike Progress Rail's Joule engines, which have to be charged up between runs, FlexDrive engines will in theory be charged completely by their regenerative braking systems, decreasing the overall fuel usage by approximately 11%, according to data from recent testing. Additionally, like Joule locomotives, FlexDrive locomotives are capable of operating on their own, but only for short distances. While pure battery-powered locomotives are advertised as a way to replace diesel locomotives for relatively cheap compared to full electrification, battery hybrid locomotives are more or less just a stopgap measure to decrease fuel consumption before electrification. Of course, this doesn't mean that freight railroads are any more likely to electrify anytime soon, but it reinforces the idea that it may happen at some point. Of course, there's still the ever-present issues that come with lithium-ion battery production, but overall I don't have as much of an issue with hybrid battery locomotives, since they can potentially decrease fuel usage by a pretty considerable amount on some trains. Further driving the point that these battery locomotives are nothing more than a stopgap measure, in late 2022, Progress Rail revealed yet another new member of their Joule family with the GT38H, a proper hybrid battery locomotive that runs off both diesel and battery power. Using a smaller, less powerful diesel prime mover, this locomotive can operate as a regular diesel, all while saving fuel with regenerative braking to charge the battery. Even more so than FlexDrive, this new GT38H is so close to being a diesel locomotive that at this point it barely feels like it's even worth investing in. It's pretty obvious that I'm not the biggest fan of battery electric locomotives, but surprisingly, there's a few very specific situations in which I think this technology could be pretty beneficial. In areas such as Los Angeles with particularly bad air pollution, battery electric locomotives could actually be a good way to decrease localized smog, but only on trains where locomotives with a short operating range wouldn't hinder operations. Luckily, 2 such instances exist in Los Angeles County, with Rail Propulsion Systems' BP4 locomotive entering service and local and switching service soon, and the Pacific Harbor Line's Progress Rail Joule switcher also being tested in yard service in the near future. Simply put, battery electric locomotives have a lot of limitations, however in a few very specific situations, these limitations wouldn't be much of an issue. Switching gears over to passenger trains though, there's quite a few smaller battery electric equipment projects that may be even worse than the freight ones. Starting with quite possibly the worst idea, Metra, Chicago's commuter railroad, has contracted Progress Rail to convert between 3 and 6 of their ancient F40PH diesel locomotives to battery power, gutting the prime movers in favor of lithium-ion batteries. While at first, this may seem like a resourceful way for the infamously underfunded railroad to reduce its emissions, these F40s will surely be plagued with issues for 2 main reasons. First off, they're 40-year-old locomotives. The 1970s era analog electrical systems certainly won't play well with the modern batteries, and if the inevitable mechanical issues aren't bad enough, these battery F40s won't even be that practical, boasting a measly 150-mile range between recharges. This means that once they finally do enter service, the F40s will only operate on a couple of lines, making a few round trips and then spending the rest of their time charging. Overall, just not something I see working well for Metra. Next up, Boston's even less functional transit system, the MBTA, has expressed interest in battery-powered equipment instead of full electrification. Allowing them to save a bit of money on the installation of overhead wires, the agency plans to purchase battery electric locomotives, although instead of following Metra's plans to charge locomotives at the end of lines, the T intends to electrify portions of their lines to recharge these battery-powered trains while in motion. I guess this could be done, but at that point, why not just fully electrify? The MBTA is doing so much electrification just to avoid electrification, but in this case, instead of the initial investment, it's paying more over time to maintain the new and likely unreliable battery electric locomotive technology. This gets even more frustrating when you realize that the MBTA's busiest line, the Providence line, is already fully electrified by Amtrak, yet the MBTA still operates diesels under the wires. It would be so easy to purchase and operate electric locomotives for this line, yet still, years after the Providence line was electrified, it still hasn't happened. Continuing our exhibition of questionable decisions made by passenger railroads, we get to Amtrak, America's national passenger rail carrier. In late 2021, Amtrak placed an order with Siemens Mobility for a fleet of intercity train sets, and included in this order was a batch of 15 dual-mode diesel and battery electric train sets for use on the Adirondack, Empire Service, Ethan Allen Express, and Maple Leaf. All these routes travel along the 10-mile-long Empire connection into the poorly ventilated New York Penn Station, so in order to not fill the station with smoke, dual-mode locomotives are currently used on these routes. This new order, however, adds an auxiliary battery car to provide extra zero-emissions power to trains when in Penn Station, in addition to regenerative braking while operating on diesel power for the rest of the route. Of the 3 passenger railroads I've mentioned thus far, Amtrak seems to be the least questionable, putting the least dependency on battery power, using it simply to increase fuel efficiency through regenerative braking. Additionally, if battery technology is found to be unreliable, it can easily be removed from trains without making too many changes to the way they work. I don't want to end this video on a negative note though, so how about a railroad that's already realized that batteries don't work? Well, that would be the busiest commuter rail in the country, the Long Island Railroad. In mid-2021, the LIRR announced its intentions to convert a few M7 electric multiple units to battery power, allowing them to operate on the non-electrified lines that make up about half of its system. After almost $1 million and a year of development, the LIRR canceled this project, stating that it wasn't a feasible way to meet its zero emissions goal by 2050, alluding to system-wide electrification as a better alternative. Of course, as of right now, countless railroads nationwide are funding research on battery electric equipment, but if the Long Island Railroad situation is a sign of what's to come, it's pretty clear that the battery trend is nothing but a misstep for the rail industry. At the end of the day, the privately owned railroads are going to do whatever they want, but after doing some simple math, it's pretty clear that battery electric trains don't work in most situations. No matter what though, battery locomotives will be used for the purpose of greenwashing, in other words, convincing non-trained people that railroads truly do care about the environment. Yes, some battery locomotives, such as Wabtec's FlexDrive, can reduce the amount of fuel used by trains to some extent. If railroads truly cared about the environment, they'd be investing in electrification, running trains off clean, renewable energy.